Right. Yes, again. The first day that we were open to the public was yesterday afternoon, and I'm like, I so don't like this new era. Like, I just want to be me, and I want to be able to like smile again and help people like the way I always have. So I do the best I can, but yeah, it's just different now because like you have distance. But if you need to hand somebody something, I'm gonna do it because they do it at the store. So it just it was interesting being open again and helping people and giving them their books. And I'm like, yeah, but the last 6 months have been interesting. Yeah, so like I keep thinking about things that confuse me, like certain behaviors and things like that. But the truth is, sometimes not everybody else is okay. But it's just that I think that sometimes we just give too much credence to something that really is not that big of a deal. Anyway, like I said, that's why I always enjoy like long hair and food and all that. Got the onions because I'm gonna make something with onions. Okay. Anyway, though, forgot me. Oh, they're shutting in there. I have this like um really interesting making Turkish delight. Like, you would think I'd be more interested in like veganized baklava, but I'm more interested in Turkish delight. I look at I'm 3% Turkish according to my ancestors, so even though I'm 20% serious. It's so funny, right? Who cares? Mm, bubbly, bubbly, drinking coffee. So last night I couldn't sleep either, and I don't know if it was just because I was like, oh, we're gonna be happening again today in the public, and I just have energy and just other things going on. But I started doing some searching because I love history, and I I was a history major. But I was always really obsessed with World War II history, and I started thinking about Tokyo Rose again. I don't know why, because I remember something a GI had mentioned about one of her broadcasts about how he said she almost gave him comfort over the radio, but then he realized she was the enemy because she was broadcasting propaganda. So I just kind of was thinking about that. I was like, well, why would these women be on the radio broadcasting? Like, did they really want to be there? So I don't know why this thought popped in my head last night at 2 a.m. in the morning. So I Googled Tokyo Rose, and even though I was a history major and I love history, I didn't really know much about like the 0 hour. And I have so much more to learn about it, propaganda that the Japanese put out because everybody thinks, oh, like Japan was a very insular society during World War II, but that's actually not true. They had been opened up in the 1850s when the US came in and basically opened them from isolation, and they had rapid fire modernization. Like Japan was a very modern nation. And even during the war, there were English language papers and radio stations in Tokyo. So, yes, I know people always say, well, Japan's a very homogenized society, they're very isolated, but they still had contact with the outside world. There were foreigners living in Japan during the war. Actually, my friend Aya Katz wrote a book about Our Lady of Kaipang. It kind of ties into some things with her book about some American and British people that were in a Japanese camp in China. It's a fictionalized account, but it's a very interesting book. So I don't know why this just kind of tied in with that, and it kind of made me think of her book. But I was thinking about Tokyo Rose, and I was thinking, did these women really want to be on the air? Was that their choice? I think about it. Obviously, these women are Westerners. They are probably of Japanese descent. They're Westerners. It turns out Tokyo Rose wasn't just one woman, but all the GIs in the Pacific, they thought that she was one woman because how would they know? Like, they almost put it this way. During World War II, there was a lot of racism towards Japanese people, and it still tinges the way that we look at that war, by the way. It's one thing to be fighting a war against your enemy, but they weren't racist against the Nazis because the Nazis were white. But the truth is, there were people in America that still held racist views against Jewish people, against even though look what the Nazis were doing to them, and against Asians. And guess what they decided to do during World War II? They took American citizens and they put them in camps. Like, how can you justify that? And in 1980, I don't know if you remember, but President Ronald Reagan was supposed to, um, they were going to compensate those families, and a lot of those people never received the money, by the way. So we talk about a lot of things right now. I think this is why some people say it's not that one movement doesn't matter over another. It's just we don't talk about this, a lot of discrimination that's happened in a lot of segments. So when it came to the Tokyo Rose thing, I was like, well, is it true that all these women just decided that they wanted to be on the radio and push out propaganda against the US? Maybe some of them really did, but Eva Toguri did not. Toguri, I think, make sure I'm saying her name right. It's Iva Toguri, Toguri. She really didn't. She was still a loyal American. She was stuck in Japan because the US government wouldn't give her a passport. In 1941, she was a new graduate from UCLA. I learned all this last night. She was a new graduate from UCLA, and she went to go visit her aunt in Japan because in Asian culture, people they care about their family and they'll send a family member to go take care of someone if they're sick. Well, she was there during the summer, and come fall, everybody knew the temperature was changing and you could feel something was in the air and war was going to be happening with Japan probably soon. It was just a matter of time. So she was trying to get back to the US, but guess what? The US consulate, they wouldn't give her a passport. The US government told her, it's okay, you're a US citizen, but you can travel to Japan just fine with this document. Okay? But when she wanted to come back, they wouldn't issue her a passport, and she wasn't able to leave the country. So the last ship left to the U.S., I think probably they say I think it was November 1941. So she's stuck in Tokyo. She is an American. I know people are like, well, she's Japanese, but she barely spoke the language. She didn't know the culture. I mean, her parents were Japanese, but she was a graduate of UCLA. This woman was born in America in 1916 during a time of rapid fire American assimilation. And I can tell you that because my grandpa, he was born in the U.S., but both my great grandparents were born in Al Shara, Syria, and he spoke Arabic. Okay, he didn't know English when he went to kindergarten, and kids threw rocks at him at school. Like, this woman was far more Americanized than my grandpa was. Okay, like, that's one reason I've always had a respect for the immigrant experience, because I was a history major and I talked to my grandpa and he told me these stories and they resonated with me forever. So this woman, she was very Americanized, and it's very problematic and troubling just to think the US government abandoned her. She was abandoned in Japan. She didn't have any recourse, anybody to protect her, okay? So she's in a country, like she may be of Japanese descent, but she's American, okay? She doesn't really speak the language. She doesn't know the culture. So once the war starts, they consider her an enemy. And her family didn't even really want her to live with them anymore. So she had to start looking for work. So just think about it this way. What are you going to do if you're an enemy foreigner living in a country during war? How are you going to find work? So she basically took some work at a newspaper, and then later she had to basically, what is she going to do? She had to work on a radio. And she never said anything bad about America. She was called Little Orphan Anne, and she was actually very open about it. She said the only thing she would agree to do would to actually be like just to say some things on the radio before song came on, but she never said anything against the US government. But later on, after the war, okay, there's this anti-Asian sentiment in our country. Asians didn't have citizenship in this country until 1943. Like Chinese Americans, they were born abroad. They couldn't even become citizens until 1943, and the only reason that was fast-tracked was because of World War II and because the U.S. was allied with China, and they wanted to have like this good will towards Chinese Americans. So, and then look what happened to the Japanese being sent to camps, the Japanese Americans. So, yes, a few German people ended up in camps. There's some interesting stories about that, but they didn't do like, yes, there was some discrimination against speaking German because there were actually German speaking communities in the US. There still are actually the Mennonites, the Amish, but there was a lot of discrimination against Asians, and it continued on. And people think, oh, well, like they don't really think about it, but Asians, they work really hard and they struggle, and they've been wrong. Like they've been wronged a lot too. So I just feel like this is just another issue. Like, why don't we talk about this? And what happened to Iva Toguri was so wrong. Like she was pardoned by the US government. They found out she didn't do anything wrong. Okay. But there was a radio personality in the US that was upset. She wanted to come back to America, even though she was an American citizen because she's Asian, okay? And they saw Asians as being less than. So he started a campaign against her and said, well, she is Tokyo Rose and she was out to get America. And they had the most expensive trial up to that point in US history. And the jury really they just couldn't convict her because they didn't see that she'd done anything wrong. So they kept telling the jury to go back and come up with a verdict because of all the money they had spent. Okay. She's a woman, just think about this, but she's of Japanese descent. And they really want to get her, even though she didn't really do anything wrong. So they did. They got her on one count of treason, saying, well, she spoke into a radio in 1944 regarding ships, U.S. ships. But it turns out later on, she actually was giving the Americans information about what the Japanese were going to do, like secretly. And she took American POWs in Tokyo medicine. Like she's an American, and she was very stoic. If you ever watch Iva Toguri in interviews, she just says, "Well, I took medicine to, my compatriots. I did what I had to do, and I was just very calm and stoic about it." But they just wanted to have a bad guy. They just had to take someone down. So they took her down and they convicted her of treason, and she was in jail for like 10 years. I think she only served about 6 because she was a model prisoner. And when she got out, she had been stripped of her U.S. citizenship. She was still living in the U.S., but she actually appealed. And in 1976, Gerald Ford, like people are like, oh, we hate Republicans, blah, blah, blah. But Gerald Ford, maybe he's one of the more forward-thinking U.S. presidents. He pardoned her, okay? Because he looked at the history and he saw that she had been wronged, and later they dug into it, and the U.S. government had actually went back to Japan, and there were some Japanese Americans that denounced their citizenship because it was, I don't know, it was probably better for them to do that. They had been in Tokyo at that point, people that were stuck when the war started. And they brought these people in to like say that they had both heard her say something that was just really improbable. Like they basically the US government conspired against her, okay? And there was this big trial, a very expensive trial against her, and she had been wrongfully accused of treason and convicted. And Gerald Ford did the right thing and he pardoned her. And I think that's pretty neat. Like when you look at the history, I'm like, wow, that is amazing. Like people don't say much about Gerald Ford, but he was he may have been a Republican, but he was an environmentalist. He started the EPA, which I don't completely hate the EPA. I think it's just the modern rendition of some of these things. I actually think that we need some environmental protections. It's just how contentious it is now. But it's just amazing to think, oh, there was a time in the 70s where there was a Republican president and he was like thoughtful enough to pardon someone who had been wronged. And people forget these things. So right now, I'm just thinking we have this really contentious presidential election where like Republican versus Democrat and one side's good and one side's bad. But just look at history, okay? And I'm not really a fan of the people running for president right now, to be honest with you. I'm just not. They're not my favorites. I loved Gary Johnson back in 2016. But like when people say, well, somebody's bad, somebody's good, sometimes in history, occasionally things can be skewed. And this happens a lot. It happened, gosh, I could talk about history for hours. It happened with Captain Bligh, Mutiny on the Bounty. Like he wasn't the tyrant that he was made out to be. He was a horrible leader. But there were some people that made against him, and when they caught them in Tahiti and brought him back to Britain, they didn't want to be hanged, so they concocted a plea, like saying, "Well, our leader like was retiring, he was so mean," but the truth was he just was not very charismatic. And they had been in Tahiti for 10 months, and the men didn't really want to leave because a lot of them became attached to the women. And the mutiny was more about some people wanting to stay in Tahiti and not go back to England than Captain Bligh being this tyrant. But there's movies and books that portray him as being this horrible tyrant when actually, okay, I have several books that talk about how that's not exactly the case. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't the tyrant that history made him out to be. So sometimes you have to dig a little bit deeper, even right now. Okay, so I can say I don't love the president. I don't think I just, I'm not going to defend. He's not like the best president. But before the pandemic, the economy wasn't really that bad. And he says things I don't agree with. But there's a lot of people from different backgrounds that support him. So I don't know. I don't support him. But here's the thing, I'm more of like a civil liberties person, but the Democrats don't really do that either. And I miss a time, like when I was young in the 90s and early 2000s, where you could talk about politics and history because I was history major and have these great discussions about it, and people wanted to learn things and they could each have their different views. Like one girl I went to school with, she was a Republican. And I don't agree with her views, but I really like her. She's a really good artist. She's a really interesting person. She's a social worker. And she's not a bad person just because of who she votes for. But right now, things are so skewed. People are like, oh, somebody thinks that, and somebody thinks that. And I'm just like, oh. So I do still read the news, but I need a little bit of a buffer because when you go back in history and you start researching things and you see, well, look what could happen. Like, let's say somebody isn't liked because of what side they're on or their nationality or anything, and things could be skewed against them. And I think right now what people are forgetting is there are other, like, I think it's so, okay, we have a horrible history of what we've done to African Americans. That's horrible. We can't excuse that. But we don't talk about like other ethnicities and their struggles in this country too. Because their struggles are also important. And I think that's one thing that we have to highlight. And as a history major, I'm like, yes, like we have to talk about that, especially Asian Americans. Like people think Asians have it so easy, like, oh, because they're really smart in school. But there are some Asian people that they're not academically inclined, and that stereotype is kind of used against them. And then the history just you couldn't even own your own business if you were of Chinese or Japanese descent um, before World War II. If you were born abroad, your children could own the business. They were born in America, but you couldn't. And Chinese Americans didn't even become citizens until 1943. Okay, and that was only fast tracked because of World War II, really, to show favor to Chinese being trying to be an ally. I'm glad that when I was young, I watched a lot of like Asian themed movies because was a history major later on, and I watched The Lost Emperor, and then I read more about Asian cultures, and I started to see these things because I'm like, I think also too, I think about my own background being part Syrian. People would probably be like, "What's this matter?" Like I said, my grandpa. Like I think about him, he lied about being Syrian because he felt like he would be discriminated against. He used to tell people he was Greek because when he was young, the whole incident with the rocks being thrown at him, like he felt like, well, I need to become very Americanized quickly. My parents don't speak English. His parents don't speak English, so he had to learn it at school. And he ended up marrying somebody that wasn't of Syrian background. Some people still marry within their community, but like the people that were rapid fire, like put into rapid fire assimilation, like they lost their culture, okay? And I could tell it always bothered him because I would talk to him and he'd be singing songs in Arabic and he would be like, I feel like I became more Syrian again at the end of my life. And I just kind of sad because I'm like, he had to virtually give up part of himself. And then I had an uncle who, like, I don't know, my grandma would say things like that he never spoke English correctly, even though he was born in this country, that he had an accent. And we don't talk about those things. So I just implore you to think, even though right now I know, look, a lot of people have been wronged in this country, in all cultures really. But don't make an assumption that certain people are more privileged than others because you don't even know their struggle. Like even when it comes to like white people, Irish people were not treated well in this country. A lot of Irish people were basically treated like indentured servants, which is almost like slavery, really. Later on in the 1860s, when you had more immigrants coming because of the potato famines, Irish people couldn't always find work. There were signs that would say no service to Italians and Irish. So there's been a lot of different forms of discrimination. Slavery is deplorable. And I think what happened to African American people is hideous. But what about happened to Native Americans? A lot of people have been wrong. I just think if we're going to talk about, this is just my thought, if we're going to talk about the past and history and how people have been wrong, instead of just saying it's only one group of people, I think we should acknowledge that many groups of people have had to struggle, and we shouldn't make assumptions about people. It's just the history major in me. That's why I can't really join a certain movement because, like, look, I support anybody and whatever they do, whatever their truth is, but I don't agree with that just one group of people have been wronged. Just look at history. Like, here's an example. What about what happened to Eva Toguri? Like, she was really wrong, and she was very stoic about it. And when her U.S. citizenship was restored, she just lived her life quietly in Chicago. But do you think what happened to her was correct? That would have happened, like, most likely, if she'd been a German person, like of German ancestry in Germany on the radio. I don't think that would have happened to her. It had a lot to do with her being of Asian descent. There was a lot of racism. Like if you go back to World War II and you look at, it was actually considered patriotic to be racist against Asian people. It's very scary. And there's movies, okay, like John Wayne movies where they call Japanese people a slur, and it was kind of encouraged. Like so, when some people say, well, what about other discrimination in this country? They have a point. They really do, especially if you were an immigrant person who came here and didn't speak the language, or your parents were from another country and you were basically judged because of your ethnicity. So I don't know. It's just like I wake up and I start thinking about history. But yeah, that's why I haven't joined a certain cause or movement, and I have nothing against movements or causes. I just like to talk about, well, what about we just acknowledge that a lot of bad things happen to many people and we think of ways to improve the lives of all people? That's just my take on it. That's why I'm not too invested in one particular brand of politics. And some people are like, oh, politics are so disgusting. Why do you talk about that? But I try to stay away, but the history major in me is just still kind of intrigued by politics. I no longer want to affiliate. Like when I was young, I was so certain I want to affiliate with this group because this group, they're just so correct. For me, most of the Democrats. Like I just thought, well, the Democrats see things correctly. Like they're better on education, on social issues. But then as time went on, I talked to other people, and even though I might not agree with how they want to live their lives, I thought, well, how can I say that this is the best when something else works for other people? Like, if some people want to homeschool their kids, like, how does that hurt me? Okay. It really doesn't. And right now, I guess, what is it? This kind of made people realize, well, maybe homeschooling's not so bad. Oh, a pandemic in California where everybody has to homeschool their kids. Well, you might be doing it through a public school, but you're basically a parent at home with a laptop. You know, I just so I don't really want to judge my own position. Like, look, I'm not really big into like if somebody's very bigoted and they're anti-Semitic or anti-Asians or anti-African American, like they're just very racist. I don't think I would want to relate to that person, okay? But if it's just a regular person living their lives, okay, and they're not really hurting anyone and they're just doing their own thing, like, well, here's an example. It's the whole horse riding thing. Like, I am mostly vegan, but in the vegan community, there's some people, they're very worried about people riding horses. And there was this lady who said, oh, well, I'm not really vegan, but how can we justify people riding horses? Because I don't like it. I live in horse country and a lot of, and they just kept talking about people riding horses and they didn't like people doing that. And I'm thinking, well, like I pointed out, there's a lot of cultures like indigenous Mongolian cultures where people still ride horses and they want to and they like being nomadic. So not everybody wants to live exactly the way that you want to live. If somebody's racist or bigoted, I don't think we should tolerate that. But if somebody's just living their life and I don't know, they ride a horse and you don't like it, who cares? If I would just say with this election coming up, vote for whoever you want. I think it's great that people vote, but don't like get so wrapped up in it that you delete someone off Facebook because, oh my God, their political views don't match yours. And study history. I actually kind of just like studying history more than getting really involved in the politics of the current moment because I feel like when time has passed, people aren't as like they're not as influenced by the events anymore. Like they can kind of look at it from a different perspective and not be as biased, perhaps, because everybody has a bias, by the way. Your home life, how you grew up, like it's really interesting. Gosh, I'm just rambling about history and politics, but I do that a lot on my channel sometimes. Well, I used to do it more on my other channel, but I do love history and culture. But I definitely encourage you to watch the Iva Toguri segments on YouTube. I think there's one that Glenn Beck did where a lot of people really hate him, by the way, because oh my gosh, like he said things against Obama, but later he apologized and he wasn't pro-Trump. I heard recently though, I guess he's made amends with Trump. That's his business, but Yes, I know he has some conservative views, but he was actually right when he said, what happened to Iva Toguri was wrong. And he did a segment where I guess he had somehow acquired her microphone. That was pretty interesting. And then there's also, I think, a news segment I watched from the 1970s where they actually interviewed Iva Toguri. That segment was very good. She tells you exactly what happened, and she doesn't sugarcoat it. She's very stoic. And the saddest part is she just talks about how, oh, well, my parents were in an internment camp. This is just the part that makes you really sad after the war, after she'd been cleared of everything that happened to her, like saying that she was innocent, she was an American citizen, she didn't commit treason. The US government, the military actually cleared her, okay? The military, our intelligence, they cleared her. They said she was innocent. She was held with them for a year and they cleared her and they let her go. But, her parents had been sent to an internment camp during the war, and her mother died in the internment camp, and her father was still alive. And she just said stoically, she wasn't crying, she didn't make a big deal about it. She goes, I just wanted to come home to be with my father, to see my father. And somebody was blocking her to come back. So I'm just going on a history tangent here. I'm just saying, look at history. Don't always fall for something. Like if somebody says something, like a politician, they get up and they're very charismatic or just, I don't know, very blustering, just like brash. Maybe don't fall for everything they say. Just go read the history. So, yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching.